Hello and welcome to Written Words, and as promised, today's video is another in my GCSE texts series, and we're going to look at An Inspector Calls by J.B.Priestley. First of all, to answer the trivia question that I put on my social media a few days ago, what do J.B.Priestley and I have in common? What we have in common is that we both grew up in the Bradford area. Bradford is a city in West Yorkshire in the north of England. J.B.Priestley was born in Bradford in 1894, just before the turn of the 20th century. So he saw a lot of interesting development in that area and indeed in the world at that time, having lived through the two world wars and a lot of economic and industrial development in the area. Bradford was a very industrial city at that time. It was the centre of the woolen industry. So the skyline of Bradford was filled with woolen mills, and needless to say, the mills had a huge workforce. A lot of people were needed to work in the woolen industry. Priestley served in the First World War, and in the Second World War he presented a BBC radio programme which was extremely popular. Then, following the war in 1945, there was a change of government to the Labour Party, and it was at that time that An Inspector Calls was published. So there was a lot going on in politics and in industry at that time, all of which were very important to J.B.Priestley, and many of the issues that were on his mind to do with equality between the sexes, equality in the workplace, workers' rights and the class system are very apparent in the story of An Inspector Calls. This particular edition from Firestone Books is aimed at GCSE students who are studying the play. It's an annotation-friendly version, which means that there are wide margins to write your annotations in, and at the end of each act there is a blank page for notes as well. However, it does have a nice reader-friendly layout. The print isn't too small to read, so it would be a comfortable read for any interested reader. There's also an interesting introduction at the beginning about J.B.Priestley and about the play itself. So what is this play about? Before I go into the story and talking about it in detail, I must warn you that this video will contain some spoilers. So if you haven't read the play, I suggest you go away, read it or watch it, and then come back to watch the discussion on it, because spoilers really are spoilers in this play. So, the story. The story is about a family, the Burling family, and the entire play takes place in one single room on one single evening. The family have just finished a meal. They're sitting at the dining table in their dining room, and they're celebrating the engagement of their daughter Sheila to Gerald Croft. So the main characters in the play are the four members of the Burling family, Mr. and Mrs. Burling, Sheila and her brother Eric, and Gerald Croft, and later, of course, the inspector of the title. The discussion that's going on around the table very much pinpoints a particular time in history. It is just a few days before the sailing of the Titanic, which Mr. Burling mentions in his speech. And we're also introduced to many of the themes of the play at the very beginning. The Burlings are a middle-class family. Mr. Burling is a businessman, as is Gerald Croft. Gerald Croft comes from a family who is slightly higher up in the social ladder than the Burling family, and to Mr. Burling, his daughter's engagement to Gerald represents a step up the social ladder. So he's very pleased that the engagement is happening. However, while everyone is chatting after the meal, there is a knock at the door, and a police inspector called Inspector Goole arrives on the scene. The inspector tells them that a young woman has committed suicide and is currently lying dead in the infirmary. and he begins to question the family. He begins with Mr. Burling, and it turns out that the young woman who has died was an employee of Mr. Burling who had been sacked. Gradually, each member of the household is questioned, and it turns out that every single person in the house bears some kind of responsibility for Eva Smith's death. However, when the inspector departs, having exposed everybody's misdemeanours, they start to wonder whether this man really was a police inspector. Mr. Burling telephones the chief of police, who says he's not heard of an Inspector Gould. They then call the infirmary, and it's confirmed that there is no girl in the infirmary who has committed suicide. So the inspector wasn't a real inspector after all. Until finally, at the end, there is another phone call, which turns everything completely on its head. So as this video is in the GCSE texts series, and I'm reading this play with my son because he's taking his exam on it next year, I had a look at some of the AQA questions on An Inspector Calls. And these are slightly different to the previous two texts that we looked at. The paper on Shakespeare and the 19th century novel gives you an extract from the text itself and asks you questions about that. But this paper is a different format. This paper just gives you a choice between two essay questions on the play, and there is no extract to base your answer on. You have to know the play very well, and you have to call upon your knowledge of the play and the context in which it was written. For example, looking at the paper from June 1922, the first question was, how far does Priestley present Eric as a character who learns important lessons about society in An Inspector Calls? And the second question was, Priestley shows how inequality in society leads to tragedy. How far do you agree with this view of An Inspector Calls? So the first question seems to be based on a character, and the second question seems to be based on one of the themes in the play. So the possible characters that could appear in a question would be Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling, Sheila, their daughter, Eric, their son, Gerald, Sheila's fiancé, the inspector, Edna, who is the maid, and Eva Smith, who we never meet in the play, but we know a lot about by the end of it. And some of the possible themes you could be asked about might be social inequality and class, work and ambition, social responsibility, generations and their differences, gender roles and inequalities, love and marriage, poverty and wealth. Those are just the themes that I've identified as I've been reading it, but it's possible there could be other ones as well. Let's have a go at answering a character question. Let's try to answer the question, how does Priestley portray the character of Gerald Croft in An Inspector Calls? So in order to do this, we need to bear in mind the 4 assessment objectives, which I looked at a few videos ago. As a quick reminder, those are to read, understand and respond to the text, to analyse the language, form and structure used to create meanings and effects using relevant subject terminology, to show an understanding of the relationship between the text and the context in which it was written, and to use a range of vocabulary and sentence structures for clarity, purpose and effect with accurate spelling and punctuation. So what that means is you need to understand the text itself and express opinions on it. You need to spot the writing techniques used by the writer. You need to understand the text in its historical and cultural context. And you need to be able to write well using a good level of English. So to start with, let's look at some facts about Gerald. Gerald is engaged to Sheila Burling. In fact, it's their engagement party when the play takes place. He is a businessman, like Mr. Burling, but his family are of a slightly higher social status, so the marriage would be in the Burlings' interests. Mr. Burling sees Gerald as a future business partner, not just as a future son-in-law. Sheila points out that he neglected her last summer, and it transpires that he had a mistress during that time. When the inspector has gone and all the revelations have taken place, Gerald wants everything to go back to the way it was. But having heard about everything he's done and hearing about his mistress, Sheila is not quite so convinced about that. So what is Gerald like? The stage directions at the beginning of the play are very lengthy and very detailed, and we're given a little description of every character. So we are told that Gerald is an attractive chap, about 30, rather too manly to be a dandy, but very much the easy, well-bred young man about town, whatever that means. Mr. Burling is very keen to make a good impression on Gerald, so he orders the same port that Gerald's father likes to drink. Although Gerald keeps his distance at first, he says he doesn't pretend to know much about port. And then later on he also declines the offer of a cigar. In this play, Mr. and Mrs. Burling represent the older generation, and Sheila and Eric represent the younger generation. But Gerald is somewhere between the two. We're told he's about 30, so in terms of years he is younger, but in terms of the discussion and the opinions expressed by the characters, he tends to side more with Mr. Burling than with the younger characters. For example, when Mr. Burling is complaining about the miners striking, Gerald agrees with him, saying, "I believe you're right, sir." Gerald is planning to marry into the Burling family, but there is some suggestion that his family are not 100% approving of this union. Mr. Burling says, "I have an idea that your mother, Lady Croft, while she doesn't object to my girl, feels you might have done better for yourself socially." And we're told that Gerald is rather embarrassed at that and begins to murmur some dissent, but doesn't come out with anything particularly definitive. So, suggesting that yes, that is what his mother feels. Then, when the inspector starts to question Mr. Burling, Gerald defends his sacking of Eva Smith. He says, "You couldn't have done anything else." Like Mr. and Mrs. Burling and many other members of their class, they don't think that they're doing anything wrong. He says to the inspector, "After all, you know, we're respectable citizens and not criminals." However, the mysterious girl who has committed suicide, we're told, is called Eva Smith. But then the inspector mentions that she went under different names, and one of the names is Daisy Renton. And as soon as that name is mentioned, Gerald changes. He is suddenly much less confident, and Act 1 ends very abruptly, just as the inspector is about to question Gerald. In the break between the acts, the audience is left wondering what is going to come out next. And what does come out next in Act 2 is the revelation that Daisy Renton was Gerald's mistress. But does the revelation of this affair change him? Does he really love Sheila? When he suggests Sheila should leave the room during the questioning, is he trying to protect Sheila, or is he trying to protect himself? And this is where some of the cultural context comes in, because the inspector asks Gerald, "And do you think young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things?" To which Gerald replies, "If possible, yes." It was a common view at that time, particularly among the upper and middle classes, that women were weaker than men and should be protected from anything particularly distressing. However, there is a double standard there, because he wants to protect Sheila from something distressing that might hurt her, but yet the subject of the conversation, Eva Smith or Daisy Renton, has certainly not been protected from terrible things. When the name of Daisy Renton is first mentioned, we can see the change in his character immediately, because as soon as the name is spoken aloud, he says, "Do you mind if I give myself a drink, Sheila?" He needs a drink to get him through what's about to happen. And he considers not telling the inspector anything. He says to Sheila, "So for God's sake, don't say anything to the inspector. We can keep it from him." But Sheila knows better. She realises that the inspector is going to get the information out of him, whether he likes it or not. He tries at first to brush off the inspector's questions. He said, "Where do you get the idea that I did know her?" But of course it comes out that he did. Gerald claims to be a different kind of person to Alderman Meggerty and many of his likes. Alderman Meggerty he calls a womanizer. And he suggests that he actually saved Daisy Renton from such a terrible womanizer. But did he really treat her any better? He does seem to have cared about her to a certain extent, because he found her some temporary lodgings and he did give her some money. But he admits, "I didn't feel about her as she felt about me." He speaks fairly respectfully about her. Then when Sheila returns the ring to him, he is not surprised. He says, "I see. Well, I was expecting this." He seems quite subdued and he goes out for a walk. However, he comes back later, and when the inspector turns out not to have been a real police inspector, Gerald changes again. He sides with Mr. and Mrs. Burling in thinking that everything is okay again. He apologises to Sheila for keeping a girl, more derogatory language, and he says everything's all right now. Sheila and Eric, on the other hand, are less inclined to think everything's okay now. They are very much of the opinion that lessons need to be learned from what has just happened. So, in short, Gerald seems to be a combination of both generations. He's young in age, but old in his views, and he's less able to sympathise with the inspector's message. The inspector's message is about social responsibility. Instead, he's more of the opinion of Mr. Burling that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. So that's just one attempt at answering a sample question that could appear on an exam paper on An Inspector Calls. If you're interested in exploring the play further, then you could have a go at writing a sample question about one of the other characters, or about one of the many themes that run through the play. Don't forget, when you're writing your answer, to include a combination of facts, your opinions, quotations from the text to back up those facts and opinions, and also to bear in mind the historical and social context in which the play was written. What was happening around the time that the play was written? What would be in the minds of the people in the audience as they were watching? What was life like for them? What experiences would they have been having at around that time that would have made the play relevant to them? Also, if you are studying for the GCSE, I highly recommend this book, the York Notes on An Inspector Calls, which are very, very thorough and very easy to read, as well as this book of practice tests. And also a fun aid to revision are these little cards with quick questions to test your knowledge of the play. In my next video, I'm going to be staying with plays for a little longer, and we're going to refer back to An Inspector Calls a little bit more, but alongside some other plays as well, because we're going to look at how to write a play. So if you're interested in writing plays, or you're a lover of the theatre, then watch this space for more on playwriting. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.